All right. Well, I want to say welcome to our topic today, which is Electoral College. Should it stay or should it go? We're really excited about partnering, the CoLab partnering with our honors program, as well as American Public Square. And so this is something that we're trying out for us a little bit, because this model may look just a little bit different than what normally American Public Square does, but we're excited about the opportunity to kind of play a little bit with some really hard topics sometimes and figure out, how to talk about things. So I am going to turn this over to our wonderful American Public Square friends. I do want to mention that, towards the end of this, we have the CoLab that JCCC has created some cards that you can pick up, because we are encouraging you maybe the last 10 minutes, if you're around. I know a class has to leave, and that's okay. But some cards that we have that will maybe help you kind of process what you've heard with maybe a seatmate or someone you're sitting next to, or somebody in the group. So we really want to allow you a chance to practice having some civil and civic dialogue. So anyhow, I'll go ahead and turn it over to our American Public Square friends.
Running a quick video, which will save me some words. But hi, in the meantime, I hope you have a chance to grab a cookie or two in the back of the room. Yes, and refreshments over here, so please do not be shy. Well, good evening, and thank you to our in-person as well as our virtual audiences tonight. Those of you familiar with American Public Square may recall that it is our mission to bring people together to address polarizing and often contentious issues with civility, facts, and multiple perspectives.
As you'll hear tonight, there is significant disagreement about the most important causes for this rise in anti-Semitism, as there is about where the greatest threats lie in terms of anti-Semitism today.
Everyone on this panel represents a distinct aspect of what it's going to take to have the public safety that we want to have for Kansas City.
So to start us all off, I thought it would be good to ask your guys' perspectives as Gen Zers. How do you think things are going?
The George Floyd incident didn't happen here, but it touched a nerve across the country, and it started a conversation that needed to not just start but to continue. The problem is the voices have gotten so loud on both sides of the discussion, we can't talk.
So from my point of view, the problem here is the lack of social cohesion and the breakdown of something that unites us as Americans. And to me, the way you fight that is by finding people you disagree with and talking to them like they do at American Public Square.
We have this agenda right now to reduce carbon dioxide emissions when we're not facing a climate crisis.
So when I hear how this amendment is neutral, it's very concerning for my community, because there is no neutral decision for a BIPOC community.
Violent crime has increased, and sensible gun laws will save lives.
The reason that the state legislature wouldn't change policing is because they know they have a red meat issue.
Now that we've talked about so many of these issues, what do we do about them? So what, now what?
So what, Gen Z cares about politics. So what, Gen Z maybe disagrees with you on a lot of stuff.
So what? We have a very important decision on or before August 2nd.
Now what? Let's get back into this country into a place where teachers are respected, not vilified by legislation.
Now what? We need to work together to build a better society where 2/3 of all gun deaths in America aren't suicide.
We don't have to settle for the current partisan invective. Rather, we need to demonstrate a better way, especially to those who are young, before what they see around them becomes in their minds an acceptable way for our society to operate.
The message people living in democracy must understand, more than any other message, is that there are Americans who aren't just like you. They don't live like you, they don't have families like yours, and they don't think like you. They may not live in your neighborhood, but this is their country too. Thank you all for coming out, and good night. May we see you all again.
All right, so that's the video. I love that video so much because it does such a better job of encapsulating what we do at American Public Square than I could ever do in just a brief couple of minutes with introductory remarks. So my name is Claire Bishop. I'm Executive Director at American Public Square. I'm really thrilled to be here at Johnson County Community College today, partnering with the CoLab, welcoming our panelists from UMKC for this conversation about the Electoral College. As you probably gathered from the video, what we're all about is bringing people together to have civil and fact-based conversations about contentious issues that divide society. Sounds easier than it is, probably. I don't know, actually. Probably doesn't sound very easy, and it's not. But it's important. And as you all, as students, joining classes this semester, we know there were lots of protests roiling campuses across the country last year. There's a big election coming up, if you hadn't heard. So there are lots of things to disagree about. And we are all about working to improve the tone and quality of public discourse through events such as this, and connecting people with tools and resources to help build and strengthen civil society. So we're really excited to host this conversation today, again in partnership with JCCC and the CoLab here on the Electoral College. Not a controversial issue at all if you've been following that topic. We have a couple of tools that we use to help keep conversations civil. We're not going to be using every single one of them today, but we do have live fact checkers here so that can help make sure that our conversations stay fact-based. We also welcome and encourage questions from you, our audience. So we've got these cards on one side, and Jamie over here and Trisha over here will hand these out to you if you're interested in asking questions or requesting a fact check. On one side, you can write down your fact check, and we'll submit it to the fact checkers. Other side, you can write down your question, hold it up, someone will gather it, and we'll ask that to our panelists through our roving reporter. The signage that you see here outlines some of the other tools that we use. We ask that no one, applaud or hoot and holler during the program. That also helps keep things civil and on the up and up. I have one other item of business that I need to do, which is making a proper introduction to our panelists. And so I'll be doing that now, and then I'm going to step aside, and this conversation's going to get going. Professor Alan Rostron joined the UMKC Law School faculty in 2003. He teaches and writes in the areas of constitutional law, tort law, products liability, and conflict of laws. Before becoming a teacher, Rostron worked in Washington, D.C. as a senior staff attorney at the Brady Center to Prevent Gun Violence, where he was a part of a nationwide litigation effort that included lawsuits brought against gun manufacturers by several dozen major cities and countries. Rostron began his career working as a law clerk for Judge Thomas S. Ellis III of the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia, and then as a litigation associate at the Cavith, Swain, and Moore law firm in New York City. So please join us in welcoming Professor Rostron. Professor Daniel Weddle joined the UMKC Law School in 1996 and serves as Director of Academic Support. A former high school teacher and administrator, Weddle has focused his research on issues in educational law, especially those concerning violence and bullying in schools. In 1999, Professor Weddle took leave from the law school to serve as interim dean of operations for the UMKC School of Education. While there, he worked closely with the Kansas City, Missouri School District, KCMSD, in a pilot project placing seniors from the School of Education in the KCMSD schools as full-time teachers with KCMSD faculty mentors. Prior to joining the law school, he practiced with the Working Group PC in Kansas City, Missouri, where he specialized in business, family law, and tort litigation. Prior to beginning his legal career, Weddle served as academic dean and English instructor at Maranatha, thank you. I was just going to keep stumbling with that one. Maranatha Academy in Kansas City for 12 years. I also want to say that the conversation will be moderated by JCCC faculty member, and I don't have your introductory information, so I apologize, but I'm going to hand you the microphone and ask you to introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Ernesto Espindola. I teach political science here at JCCC. I was born and raised abroad, so my approach to this issue will be from a somehow comparative and philosophical perspective. Welcome. So, as I said, I was born and raised abroad, and when I was studying political science in Argentina, my constitutional law professor suggested the reading of a book written by Robert Dahl, this was in Spanish, but the book was, is the U.S. Constitution democratic or not? And so from a long time now, I've been interested in this topic, and I'm going to reach out to two philosophers that more or less, or to a certain degree, influence the constitutional moment in the Americas, in the presidential Americas. You have three big theories on the origin of government. One of them is the contractarian theory, and this is the one that is pertinent for a better understanding of constitutionalism. I'm just going to talk for 10 minutes, so I'm going to skip some aspects on the theory. But the key idea here is that it is our rationality that allows us to agree at a certain point that it is in our best benefit to create the state. Because before, when we were living under, in a pre-political state, in the state of nature, our rights were threatened by others. So we agree to create this arbiter who has the monopoly of violence and who therefore is more effective in terms of guaranteeing our rights, okay? So we create the government. Of course, then you have the Marxist approach to the origin of government and other authors, but let's focus on the contractarian theory. The Americas were influenced by two key philosophers, John Locke, it's more familiar probably to you all, and then Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was from Switzerland, but he then moved to Paris. They both wrote two key treatises, one on civil government, John Locke, and the social contract, Rousseau. The point I'd like to highlight here is that John Locke is considered the father of liberalism, and of course he underpins his theory on the principle of popular sovereignty, but the consequence of the social contract is different. And to some extent, this notion was inspired the Declaration of Independence of the US, not just by John Locke, but in part. Key difference: once we create the contract according to Locke, we still remain as individuals. Whereas for Jean-Jacques Rousseau, our nature is transformed by this social contract. So we become a collective entity that has a general will, okay? And this is embodied in the national legislature. So you don't have to put it in more concrete terms, the idea of federalism does not apply to Rousseau's social contract. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. If you take a look at this declaration, you will see that the terminology pretty much stems from the contractarian theory and from John Locke in particular. Once again, John Locke was not the only philosopher that influenced the founding fathers, but he was one of them. And I'd like to just highlight a few elements here. Those that I like to highlight, I will read them out loud. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Pursuit of happiness is a way, it was a way of translating a more philosophical term in John Locke, which is the private property, okay? Now let's start from here. That whenever any form of government that we create becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government. Now, at the end, of course, he's not a revolutionary as such. He says that we need to be prudent because we shall not overthrow long-lasting governments for superficial reasons. The reason why I mention this is because I think it is interesting to think whether the Electoral College whether it should stay or it should go, whether that's a transient, a superficial cost to alter part of the government or the state or not. That's something up for debate, of course. So I guess my point is that even if we were to draw on the founding fathers, we can still find a philosophical justification for a potential reform, provided this is what we want. I'm not going to go into the details due to temporal restrictions right now, but the 1787 U.S. Constitution created then a liberal and democratic republic. Liberal should be emphasized a bit more than democratic, but not a democratic general will in the style of the French approach to democracy. And also, this federal contract had to negotiate the power distribution with the states, okay? And we know this, I'm not gonna go into the details, but we can see that the Great Compromise is a way of somehow coming to terms with this contract and the idea that it is a federal contract, okay? But what was problematic according to Hamilton, I was reading the paper 68, is it was not so much that most delegates to the Constitutional Convention were against the principle of popular sovereignty. It was that they had to negotiate. They had to create a government that was a federal government that was agreed by both those who wanted a strong federal government and those who were more in favor of states' autonomy. Okay, but the principle of popular sovereignty was not at issue, as it were. Of course, some nuances are part of that argument. The main concern, and this is, I found this in Edwards, this is not my idea. The main concern as to why presidents back then should not be elected directly, it was because due to a lack of communication, it was a huge country, there was a lack of communication, so the delegates from different states thought that this parochialism was going to make citizens more likely to vote for presidential candidates from their states. Okay, so once again, think about this. It was the fear of the states of having a presidential candidate from a different state that might not necessarily represent the interests of the state. So once again, the idea of a nation, such as Rousseau's idea of nation, of this national legislature, was not there. Can citizens ignore national affairs due to a lack of communication, as it was the case in 1787? That's something we can think about right now. As a liberal and democratic republic, the U.S. can reform its constitution. How we elect the president is not a light, superficial cause, according to the Declaration of Independence, namely according to the philosophical element upon which this republic was founded. And I'll end with this. Are the people of the American nation willing nowadays to prioritize the principle of equality among national citizens over that of equality of states when it comes to the election of the president? There are pros and cons, and I think the project as such, the reason why we're gathered here is a good way to debate in a moderate and respectful way in order to see whether the pros and cons outweigh the pros and cons and see whether we want this reform or not. Thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate kind of the little bit of history to kind of bring us up to speed. So we're going to let our wonderful American Public Square friends come in and kind of help get this dialogue started.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having us, hosting us today. Thanks for joining us as we start to dig into different perspectives and opinions on the value of the Electoral College. And maybe a good question to start with is, in your opinion, what are the origins of the Electoral College and what is its place in American politics? over time. Do you want to start us off, Professor Weddle?
Sure.
Okay.
The original purpose of the Electoral College has basically evaporated, at least part of that purpose. And that was that the framers were concerned that we had an illiterate population and lack of communication. With universal education, that first concern is pretty well gone. Most of the country is literate. Whether reasonable or not, they're at least literate. And mass communication has made information almost overwhelming. So we're not really worried about those two things. The other thing I think drove the formation of the Electoral College was something that runs throughout the Constitution, and that is avoiding the tyranny of a majority, making sure that minority voices and minority voices are heard, political minorities. Think about it this way. Imagine a national election for the Senate. That the Senate, every seat in the Senate is up to a national vote. What's going to happen? California, New York, some of the big population centers are going to have an outsized, a vastly outsized number of senators out of the 100. States like Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas may have none. That means that those regions with a higher population make all the senatorial decisions are made by some population centers. And I'll tell you, New York doesn't worry about water the way Arizona does. And so there are all kinds of concerns in a continent this size that people from different regions just don't understand those other concerns. And so the Electoral College is consistent with what we did in the Senate and what we've done in the House, where you have proportional seats in the House. And the Electoral College kind of repeats that because the electors, every state gets 2 electors, just like 2 senators. Every state gets the number of electors that it has representatives in Congress, and then DC gets 3, which gets us to the 538 that we now have. What that does is it spreads the power of the national vote in the election for president. It spreads that out a little bit and caps the power of the huge population centers from dominating the vote.
Okay, great. And before I pass it on to ask if Professor Rostron wants to add to or challenge anything, I'd just like a show of hands, and we can be brave in here because we're all learning today. How many of you feel like you've got a good understanding of what the Electoral College is, how it operates? You feel like you have, we don't have to level set that. Okay. So that gives you gentlemen, an idea about, as you speak and think about the opinions on it, reminding us about its function. You want to add to or challenge anything? And I'm going to add a question. Does it limit or expand democracy, and has that evolved?
There are definitely, pros and cons to the Electoral College. I'm not a big fan of it, so I'll speak more, of it from a negative perspective. But there's good arguments for it too. As far as the origins of it, which we've heard a little bit about already, I'll add one other thing. If you want to attack the Electoral College, if you're talking with your friends and you want to argue with them that it's a bad idea, here's one you can throw in that's kind of persuasive. I don't know historically really how compelling it is, but at least this is an argument people like to make, that it was in part inspired by slavery. By the existence of slavery, right? They had to decide, how to cope with the institution of slavery back in that era. And as you may know, one of the issues, so slaves were not going to be able to vote, right? They weren't considered citizens and weren't able to vote. But the South wasn't that happy about it because then they weren't going to get credit for all those people, right? All the enslaved people were largely in the South, and they weren't going to get credit for that in the number of seats they'd have in the House of Representatives. And so they came up with this weird bargain called the 3/5 compromise, where they would count enslaved people for 3/5 of a person for purposes of the apportionment of the seats in the House of Representatives. Well, if you think about it, if they did the presidential election just based on a big popular vote, like just count all the votes of everybody, it doesn't matter what state they live in, the enslaved people weren't going to get to vote. So the South was going to essentially get less influence on the outcome of the election because all their enslaved people were not going to be able to vote. And so one way to get around that was to say, well, you know what, we'll have the Electoral College, which will be the number of seats in the Electoral College is based on how many senators and how many representatives you have in Congress. So essentially it sort of pulls in that the effect of that 3/5 compromise that you would get credit. The southern states would get credit for the enslaved people to some extent in the presidential election, just like they did in Congress. So I think that's an argument that a lot of people like to use. Now, don't misuse it and say, so this means that if you like the Electoral College, you're a racist and you are in favor of slavery. It doesn't mean that. It just means that, as kind of was said before, some of the purposes of the Electoral College are just obsolete now. Slavery's not, it's abolished a long time ago by the Constitution, so it's just not an issue. So do we need to keep doing the Electoral College that way unless there's other good reasons for it? In terms of how it impacts the current modern situation with elections, one effect that it has, you could say this is bad or good, but it narrows down the number of states that really matter in the election. Right? If you follow politics, you probably know which states, where do you see Trump and Harris and their running mates, where do you see them going? They're in Pennsylvania about every day. They go to Arizona, they go to Georgia, they go to Michigan, they go to Wisconsin, etc. They don't come to Kansas City, right? I don't see them campaigning around here. Why? Because they know who's going to win Missouri and Kansas. And they don't have an incentive to campaign in California. They have an incentive to go there and raise money from wealthy people, but they don't really have an incentive. So it narrows down the number of places that are really battlegrounds, and the rest of the country sort of gets taken for granted. And then that can distort decision making. It's a big deal, for example, what position Kamala Harris is taking on fracking, because Pennsylvania is important. So she's got a bias to, I got to appeal to people in Pennsylvania because they like fracking or it creates jobs there or whatever. So maybe that's sort of a distorting effect. I totally forgot. Now, what was the additional question that you added?
I'm so tuned in, I forgot to. No,
Okay,
I'm just kidding. Do you feel like, and I think I know where you're going to go with this, but when we think
is it democracy?
Yes,
yeah.
Expand or
it's certainly, and Professor Espindola was talking about this. It's less of a pure democracy than it would be if all our votes just counted for the presidential election. Just you get the most votes, you win. That would be a more purely democratic way of doing it. Now, that's not necessarily bad because, again, as he said, and as Dan referred to as well, we don't have a purely the founding framers of the United States did not want to create a pure democracy. They thought democracy was like, if it was a pure majoritarian democracy, they thought that was chaotic. That was just mob rule. They had very aristocratic ideas about who knew the most and who was a great leader, and the mass of people, the rabble, were not necessarily so much to be trusted, and so they wanted a system where they didn't want 51% of the American people to just do whatever they want, and that's what they got. So it is less democratic, but that could be good or bad.
Okay, great. Professor Espindola, you're good right now. Okay, great. If we have any questions from the audience, I don't know where Jamie is, but if you have questions in the audience, if you write on that and hold it up, excuse me, Claire or Jamie will come around and grab it. Or if you have a fact check or a question for us to look up, certainly let us know, and we will get to that. Yes?
One thing that I always like to tell my law students is that any really serious legal question, and this would be true of constitutional questions, is a collision of right answers. In other words, and I always say a legal issue is a collision of right answers brought into tension by some accident of the human condition. So that's why you'll have reasonable arguments on both sides. When you plant your feet and say there is no reasonable counter argument, you've just closed your mind, and that's where we get uncivil discourse, is not realizing there's good points, as Professor Rostron said. There are pros and cons, and the intelligent approach is to examine the pros and examine the cons, and then try to weigh it out, what's better for the nation. So, I'm not married to the Electoral College either. I'm not opposed to it. I'm still kind of torn myself as to whether it's still a good way of spreading power through the entire body politic and protecting against abusive concentrations of power. So I kind of lean toward it, but then maybe I'm leery of changing the Constitution, usually because I'm not sure there are unintended consequences that we have not had to live with up to now.
Great point, and I'll pass it over to you, Professor Espindola. Great point, and I think a lot of legal minds refer us back to the framers, that they made it really difficult to change the Constitution. And there are reasons for that, and those linger on into the arguments about what still applies today. And as some of those foundational pieces, other factors have evolved, we still think about it should be difficult to change that. I'd also like to consider, before I pass this over to Professor Espindola, and you started to touch on this, Professor Weddle, how does it impact the polarization that we're experiencing, and has that changed over time? You know, has the way the Electoral College, Professor Rostron made the great point that it impacts our politics because candidates at the national level play to the advantage they can get in the Electoral College, and some of us never get access to, they're not appealing for our vote. How is it impacting the polarization that we're experiencing, and is there something we can do about that short of dissolving it? Professor Espindola?
Well, I have open-ended questions. I don't have clear or definitive answers. When we compare constitutional experiments in the Americas, the presidential system in the U.S. has always been a role model in terms of stability. As opposed to the stability of this institution, Latin America has a history of frequent constitutional replacements. The case of Ecuador has had 20 constitutions in less than 200 years. Only Venezuela beats that number, 26 constitutions. So that said, there is a pro to the stability of this country. However, and this is an open-ended question as an outsider, as a political scientist, I think it is interesting and it is a strength, at least that's how I've been formed to believe in terms of political science, that it is a strength for the country to have a solid constitution. However, I wonder whether nowadays you have a crisis of representativeness, a gap between what the majority of the ordinary people want in terms of policies and the political class. And if that were to be the case, how, I know the answer to this question, but amending the Constitution is very difficult, all the more so nowadays with a polarized country. So those 2/3 majority, supermajority in both houses of the national legislature, Congress. And on top of that, you have to have, please correct me if I'm mistaken here, but 3/5, 4/5 of the state's legislature ratifying that supermajority. So it's very difficult. So if there is a crisis of representativeness, how would the citizens find a strategy in order to, as it were, bypass this constitutional gridlock and make an amendment that would, in case this is what is wanted, abolish the Electoral College? It is very difficult from an institutional point of view.
I'll just say that the Electoral College isn't going anywhere. It's not going to be. There's not going to be an amendment passed that takes it out of the Constitution. So we're stuck with it. What is happening right now is an extra constitutional attempt to dampen its effects so that states agree to throw all of their electoral votes to the popular vote winner, which in essence just works around the Electoral College. But
What's
it's a
what's the
fantasy
name of that? That
it's called the National. Let me look at it so I say it right. National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. And those that sign on to it, as I understand it, agree that they'll throw all of their electoral votes to the popular vote winner.
to the national popular vote winner.
Popular vote winner. And that basically takes the Electoral College off the table if every state were to sign. But number one, every state has not signed. I think it's 20 some have. And there's nothing that necessarily binds them to stick to it if they don't want to. The legislatures don't have to stick to it, and so it's not a foolproof solution to what people think may be the downsides of Electoral College.
Yeah, I would just add something to that. I mean, let's be real about what it would take to change it. There have been 5 times, you can fact check this, there have been 5 times, I think, in history when the popular vote winner, lost the Electoral College and lost the election. The last 2 are pretty recent, 2016 and the year 2000. And both times the Republican candidate won. So if you're a Republican and looking at the data this year, the Republicans seem to have an electoral advantage, again, Electoral College advantage again. Why would you support a change in it, right? And it's not just that the Republicans are selfish. If the Democrats had that advantage, they would want to keep it, right? They're not foolish. So what it would take to change it is we would need an election sometime in the near future when the Democrats still remember the bitterness of 2016 and, Hillary Clinton got 2% more votes, but she lost the Electoral College. We would need Democrats to remember how they felt about that and then have an election where the Republican candidate gets burned by the Electoral College and feels like got the popular vote but lost the Electoral College. And then maybe there would be a bipartisan movement where people would say, this doesn't make a lot of sense. One of the things about the issue is it's relatively easy for people to understand. Americans don't have to be extremely into politics to understand that it's a little weird. Right? It would be like if in baseball, if they announce, we're considering a new rule in baseball. From now on, the winner of the game will not be the one who has the most runs. It's not based on total runs. It's based on how many innings you won. So if you could score 10, 20 runs in a game and you just crush the other team, it's a blowout. But if you happen to have got all those runs in like 2 or 3 innings, then too bad for you. You're out of luck. That would be kind of weird, at least the way we're used to thinking. And it's not the way we normally think about elections. Who cares if you got all your votes in a minority of the states? You still got the most votes. So I'm sure Professor Weddle is right. It's not going to change, but I think the only way it could is both sides have to get burned by it at least once to start to turn against it.
And I'm going to ask one more question, and then we're going to go to our fact checkers to give us an update on a couple of fact checks. Any audience questions yet? Let us know. Oh, wonderful. Okay, we'll have Jamie or Claire. We've got a question over there. Are there trends in this movement to change the Electoral College that you see? For example, the states that have signed on, are they more populist states? Do they lean politically one way? What are the trends that we see that could align with some of the predictions you're making?
It's the Democratic states that would like to change it because they've lost twice. And that bias in the Electoral College that happens to exist in favor of Republicans right now is not universal and inevitable. It's not always there. Back in I can't remember if it was 2008 or 2012, but it looked like that if it was going to make a difference, it would favor Obama, just the way his votes, happened to be dispersed across the different states. It looked like if there was going to be a difference and somebody was going to win the Electoral College without actually having the most votes overall, it would have been Obama. But it didn't work out that way. But it's the blue states that are more democratic would be, at this point, would be willing to support this interstate compact, and the more Republican states, they don't have an incentive to do so.
Okay, great. Fact checkers, you want to come up? Yeah. Will is going to, yes, that's great.
So it's true. There has been 5 times where the presidential election winner has not been the winner of the popular vote. It has the Jackson 1824 election, the Hayes and Tilden 1876, Cleveland and Harrison of 1888, and then Gore and Bush in 2000, and Clinton Trump in 2016. I believe that also he was talking about what it would take to ratify an amendment. I have it here. Truman Library says, I just have a source. Yeah, that's great. So it has to be passed by 2/3 of both houses in Congress, and then ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the states. So clearly it would have to be like a large bipartisan effort for everyone has to be on board. We have to agree. Okay.
Great. Yes, thank you, Will. That was super. Probably a lot of years in there that teachers in schools weren't talking about the Electoral College at all. You point out a lot of Americans don't understand it, but since 2000, it has kind of gotten a little traction, and people are interested, probably a result of our choice for the topic today. Here, I wonder if you want to speak to, at the heart of the tension today, do you think it's changed very much from the tension the framers were trying to address by creating it?
Thomas Jefferson said in public that John Adams was a hermaphrodite and his wife was a prostitute. So it's been rough and tumble all along. And of course ended up in a civil war at one point. So our politics they've always been tough. The candidates can be really rough on each other. I remember Gore and Bush, a debate between them, and it was like they both believed all the same things. I mean, I've never seen such unanimity. It was extremely civil, but in recent years it's become terribly uncivil in the debates and uncivil in the rhetoric. So I blame that. But it isn't something that's brand new in American politics.
I just say something that is kind of more new in recent years, and it's debatable how the Electoral College plays into it. But there is concern about the election integrity and claims about whether fraud in elections and stuff like that. And it'd be interesting. You can think about it for yourself. Does having the Electoral College make that better or worse, or reduce the concerns about that? I'm not sure. On the one hand, like the last election with Biden and Trump. It was real close in some of the states that really mattered for the Electoral College. Like Biden just barely won, according to the the official results in like Georgia and Arizona and that sort of thing. So it does lead to then questions about, well, what if there was something fishy going on in Atlanta or Detroit or Arizona or whatever? If that had changed 10,000 votes, that would have changed the outcome. So in that sense, the Electoral College makes it seem more vulnerable to fraud or some kind of manipulation. Biden won the popular vote by like 4% or something, I think. And so you could say, well, if it had been based on that, it wasn't like razor thin close, so disputing some votes here and there wouldn't have made any difference. But you could easily imagine a scenario where it goes the other way. The election of 2000, a lot of you weren't alive for that, but it was, it was very close, and it came down to Florida between Bush and Gore. So it was all about Florida, and it was just like a couple hundred votes apart, and they were going crazy down there trying to figure out who really won the election in Florida and analyzing all the ballots over and over and all this stuff. Imagine if the election instead was based on the national popular vote, and it was really, really, really close. They were separated nationally by just, let's say, 1,000 votes or something like that. That chaos that you had in Florida over all those ballots would occur every single place in the United States. Any place in the United States where some election official, red state, blue state, whatever it is, if they could come in and say, oh, we found some more ballots in the back. We found another box of ballots. It could, any place in the nation, changes that they made or ballots that got thrown out or got counted could change the national result. And that might be, maybe that would be the worst chaos of all. It would be rare because out of millions and millions of votes cast, how often is it really going to be that close? But nobody ever thought it would happen even in one state like Florida, and it did.
Fascinating and excellent point. Those of us that are old enough, immediately I'm thinking hanging Chad, and I've got definitions of these words that came into our vocabulary and pictures of people in Florida in teams around tables examining, as Professor Rostron, just to drive the point home, looking at each physical ballot and did the person really mean to mark that, not recounting each of those, which is part of the founders' design to have election controlled at the state.
Yeah, well, one
level.
of the strange things to keep in mind, when we talk about what the framers intended, they didn't specify how the states would pick their electors. They didn't even say there had to be an election, and early on there wasn't, right? They didn't shift to that for several presidential elections. Early on, it was just the state legislators would just pick the electors for each state. So it was an even more indirect thing. People got to vote for the state legislature, and then the state legislatures would choose the electoral college, and then the electoral college would choose the president. So they had several levels of non-purely democratic approach to it. But today we have something different. So.
Yeah.
One of the other problems is that states, because they run the elections, they run them very differently. And with the hanging Chad, some states, if there's a dent, then it's a vote. Other states, it has to be punched all the way through. And then there's also the voting franchise in different states. The voting franchise is much looser. Felons can vote earlier than they can in other states. Mental health exemptions for bars to voters are very loose in some states and very strict in others. So that again, since we don't have a national standard for how electors are chosen and how voters can and what voters can vote, it distorts even the popular vote, and that's a real problem. I mean, part of the problem with the Electoral College is the states can do whatever they want, and they can change things to their advantage. They can do all kinds of things and that'll be true in a popular vote situation as well.
You've pointed out there are a lot of other issues related to this topic, but maybe other issues we have more control over that could impact some of these disagreements and tensions. All right, we are going to start to wrap things up, and we know some of the folks that left class schedules, some of these classes moved on. So we're going to end with a couple of audience questions and then a so what, now what from our panelists. What are the benefits of having the Electoral College today? And this question is from Andrew Thomas. Must not have thought we pointed many of those out. Do you each want to give one or two benefits to the Electoral College today?
Well, I'll just say that the Electoral College caps the power of population centers so that they don't decide every election and the rest of us are at their mercy.
Especially rural.
Especially more rural states that are less populated, but are also producing the food. So why should they be, they're very important. Well, anyway, I'll just put it at that. It caps that power.
I think the most powerful argument for the Electoral College is that the states are supposed to matter. States are supposed to be significant. They could have wiped them all out when they formed the United States. They could have just formed it as a singular country, but they instead chose to have this federal system where you have a country, but it's divided into the states, and the states were meant to be extremely significant. And even today, you might say, well, why are the laws different? Why can I do something in Kansas and it's legal, but it's illegal in Missouri, or vice versa? It's like, because they're two different states. They're different places and they're run differently, and that there should be, and that there's nothing wrong with the idea that, that matters. And here's in place where it would even matter more. Let's say the Electoral College turns out to be a tie. That's one of the downsides of the Electoral College, is it can be a tie. The popular vote could be too, but it's so unlikely with millions of votes. But we might have a tie, like 269 to 269 in the Electoral College. It will get thrown then into the House of Representatives, and every state will then get to cast one vote for who they want to be the president, based on their representatives in Congress. Every state will get the same. Wyoming will get one vote, and California will get one vote. And so if we ever have that, that's going to be even more controversial. But what it would show is the states matter. Every state is entitled. That was, I think, something that Professor Espindola said at the very beginning was, do you want a system in which we have equality of each individual person, or where we have equality of the states? And that's kind of what it comes down to.
Okay. Do you have anything to add? Nailed it. Right. Excellent. All right. This is the last audience question, and then we're going to end with a so what, now what, as we end all American Public Square programs, where our panelists will give us an idea of, okay, here's what we discussed today. Here's kind of their concluding thoughts or advice for us in some way. But here's the last audience question. Discuss the effect of the Electoral College on the two-party system. Would the elimination of the Electoral College increase or decrease the likelihood of a third-party presidential candidate?
I think the belief, at least, is, in political science and all that, is that's one of the key effects of the Electoral College, is that it reinforces and cements the dominance of two parties. Because to really have any chance of winning a presidential election, you have to win a whole state. You can't just get 20% of the vote here and 30 and 10 and stuff like that. You got to win a whole state, or else you get zero. It's all or nothing, and so it makes it really hard for third parties and independent parties and independent candidates and third parties to really make any headway, because in each state the Democrats or the Republicans are going to get all the electoral votes.
Anything to add?
No, I think that sums it up.
Okay. Well, let's move on to our final question, and it'd be great to get all three of you, to the audience that we have. So what, now what? The Electoral College or elections.
Okay. By way of conclusion, I'd like to just pose some open-ended questions, such as they were implicitly mentioned here before. This is a winner-takes-all system. So questions such as, what are the pros and cons of a proportional representation? Because if we want to have, let's say, a system that incentivizes the emergence of a third party, then questions such as, do we want to go and reform the Constitution so we, I'm not saying we should, I'm just saying, how about we take into consideration the semi-presidentialism of France after 1958, the pros and cons to that? That's one question. Another open-ended question is, even though I agree with the importance of stability and therefore the strength of the U.S. Constitution, at the same time, should we sacralize the backdrop against which the Constitution was sanctioned, or could we be more flexible about it? But once again, I don't have answers to these questions. That's the way I'd like to finish.
So what's next? Obviously the election of 2024 is coming up here. It would probably be good for the country if it's not super close. It probably will be extremely close, but it'd probably be better if it's not. I mean, if we have another election where it's really close, and let's say the Republican candidate comes out on the losing side of it, there's going to be a lot of unhappiness about that and skepticism of that. And on the other hand, if there was another election where the Democrat, let's say there was another one, a third one in this century, where the Democratic candidate got more votes overall but lost the Electoral College, I think people are going to start to feel like that really is too undemocratic, and that they're being, why is the minority getting this benefit each time. The minority party they're not getting the most votes. So it would be kind of nice if and that is one benefit of the Electoral College, is that it can make a victory seem bigger than it really was. Back when Barack Obama first got elected, he won that election by I think about 7% in the popular vote, which is a healthy margin. It's not like a razor thin, but it's not a total landslide blowout. But in the Electoral College, it magnifies that. He had like 360 votes to 170 or something like that. So he had like twice as many Electoral College votes. So it made it seem like kind of more of a landslide and more of a mandate, more of a decisive thing. And maybe one way or the other, it would be good if we had another election like that where we can at least look at it and say, well, if my side won or my side lost, at least I can't say I'm skeptical of how it turned out. It was kind of decisive.
Well, I think the big question we have to ask ourselves is, do we think representative democracy ought to be part of the presidential election? In other words, we don't get to vote on federal statutes. Our representatives do that, right? And so do we feel that representative democracy is out of place for a single office? And I think that's the real question. Since it's a single office, should power be distributed in a representative way through electors, or should it be a popular vote, one person, one vote? Is there something special about the presidency that it ought to be different from the way we do everything else in our Constitution?
Fantastic. Really interesting and engaging conversation. I want to thank our partners at the CoLab and Johnson County Community College for inviting us out today. Thank everybody who was here, everybody who is still here, and Jody Dietz and Ann Daughter for partnering with us in bringing this. Thank you, Professor Espindola, for your efforts in welcoming us on campus. And a special thanks to the UMKC Law School professors, Ellen Rostron and Dan Weddle, for your time today to come out. And we hope everybody stays tuned. Check out, I know on the rolling slides, we're part of the KC Media Collective. We have produced a nonpartisan voting guide, and I think that's probably part of the so what, now what from all of us up here, is get informed about voting registration requirements and be a part of the action in November and vote. So thank you very much.